Thank you for being here. We're off and running on one of our Wednesday sessions, so it's been a while since we were doing this regularly. Happy to be kicking them off again, and thank you guys for joining in. As usual, I'm John Van Etten, the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here in Germany. And today we talk about, in each of these sessions, sort of a different HS themed topic. So we have an hour for the topic today, and it's a good one, I hope. It's one we've received a few times in the past, but most recently from an accredited practitioner who's coaching and asked the question around how to debrief a more defensive profile. So the question is coming from, again, a coach, and we're talking about LSI, and we're really talking about the remeasurement or progress check. So once we use the instrument initially, then hopefully we're going through some development steps, and then in most of our recommendations, somewhere 6 to 9, 12 months down the road, we're doing a little remeasure, checking in, doing what we call a progress check, and then seeing how the individual has developed. This is sort of at the core of our tools, since we are specialized in developmental instruments, sort of knowing where we are and whether we've developed and to what extent, and all of those things are important. So how do we debrief and coach a profile that's become more defensive from one time to the other? So just a couple of things before I get into this. As I was thinking about it and how to answer it, I came up with sort of 3 general categories. Before we get into the topic, a couple things just to maybe be aware of. Then I'll get into the types of more defensive profiles that we might see. And then finally, maybe hopefully some debriefing tips and suggestions on how we might deal with these profiles. All right, so if you're with us, then hopefully you're familiar that with Human Synergistics, we use our circumplex model to understand these patterns or styles of behavior and psychology. So that's what we'll be referring to today as we go through these. So as we think of LSI, the first thing I would like to keep in mind is that this is fairly rare, to be honest with you. When we look across our clients, typically in LSI and LWS and across other levels as well, for the most part, thankfully, we see clients learning from the data that we've provided, taking it seriously, doing something with it, and creating positive change. It may not be as dramatic as we always hoped for, but we consistently see positive steps and improvement and development amongst our clients, and that's obviously very important to us. The second point I would make is that, when I talk about clients and successes and lessons learned, one of the things I oftentimes talk about is the fact that organizations and teams and individuals tend to either use this information, which is what I've just talked about, and sort of see benefits from it, or not. And if they sort of don't use the information and don't create an action plan and don't follow up, then typically what we see is, to be honest with you, no particular change in the profile. This is notoriously true of things like organizational culture that are quite stable over time. So it's interesting in terms of, behavior is both stable yet adaptive. But the point is, for profiles to become increasingly defensive is very, very rare amongst our clients. It's also rare across different levels. So this is the other point I wanted to make. I'm going to try to address this question at the individual level, not at other levels. It is possible, of course, and we have seen this as well, of teams and organizations that become more defensive over time. In fact, I might argue that that's a little more common and frequent than seeing individuals become increasingly defensive over time, at least while we're coaching them. But I'll be talking about this at the individual level. If there are questions toward the end around how this might play out in teams and organizations, happy to talk about that. The next point, which I don't think I have to talk about because I know everyone that I'm talking to and in our network is gone through a rigorous accreditation, and we keep up with people and make sure that our tools are used correctly. But if we're going to talk about the sorts of things that might explain why we see a more defensive profile if we remeasure, then we might need to think about and make sure that the tool is being used appropriately. I won't go into all of the odd possibilities that might be, but the point is that if as a function of using LSI or LWS in a leadership development initiative, but the purpose of that initiative is maybe inconsistent with our tools, we're trying to actually increase aggressive behavior because we think that's a good thing in our business, or we're somehow using the tools to select individuals for selection and placement purposes, which is very inappropriate, then you're going to affect the data in ways that you may well increase defensive patterns. Whether that is accurate is questionable, and really, of course, not going to focus on this because that's really in the cases where the tools are not being used properly. Okay, the next point, which is maybe just mine, but from my perspective, hey, it's better than no change at all in a way. One of the challenges that I keep running into with HS tools is that people lose perspective that these are developmental instruments, and they start to fall into the trap of believing that, I am a red person, or I am green, or whatever, and confusing this with things like personality assessments or skills and competencies and these sorts of things. Even though it's probably not what we were hoping for in terms of seeing the profile become more defensive, it does show a few things, hopefully, to the focal participant. One is that change is possible, and you are changing, right? So, I mean, one of the real hurdles for a lot of our clients is being able to do something different at all. If we have an increasingly defensive profile, and I'm mainly talking about something like LSI2, but in any case, the individual is doing something differently. They are changing their behavior. That is also being recognized by others if we're seeing this in feedback, and it probably is having additional consequences. So it's at least a way of showing that you can change, and hopefully we can learn from maybe some missteps and get back on track. The next questions are sort of technical things. This will come up a few other times as I go through the PowerPoints that follow, but one of the questions I would have is, when are we doing this remeasurement or progress check? In accreditation, we talk about this. One of the very important things is that we not remeasure or do a progress check, excuse my coffee machine, too quickly. And I'll talk about this later, but there is a known tendency for people to use some defensive behavior, especially just as they're trying to deal with and approach this change, which is the development initiative. So remeasuring or doing a progress check too quickly, you might actually see some of those patterns. I'll come back to that in a moment, but hopefully we're giving people at least 6 months, I think, is appropriate before we remeasure. Another question I might have, I get this more from consultants than I would have the concern personally, but whether it's the same feedback group. A lot of times with LSI or LWS, it's almost impossible to get the exact same feedback group that we had 12 months ago. And people are oftentimes concerned about that, and I typically am urging them not to be, because as long as these people have worked with the individual for a long enough period of time and know them, then the way that they describe them will be appropriate, and you don't have to have the same people to get consistent and accurate descriptions. Having said that, if you somehow had sort of sampling error in the way that you did this, it could be possible. So what I'm imagining is, and I've talked about this separately in terms of an LSI and LWS, one of the patterns amongst breakouts or subgroups that we oftentimes see is things like people behaving more constructively toward their direct reports, and behaving perhaps more aggressively, especially competitively, against people on their own hierarchical level, the peer group. So if we assume that to be true, and it just as an example case, if I were to do LSI initially and mainly include people from my direct report group, and then develop for 6 months and remeasure, but this time gain feedback almost exclusively or primarily from my peer group, it may look as though my profile has gone from constructive to aggressive, when really that's more a result of significantly different feedback groups that we're asking, if that makes some sense. So that sort of thing I think is pretty rare and impractical to happen, but it might be a question in terms of how much that feedback group may have changed, or whether we're changing how we're gaining that feedback. Okay, the last question or thing to keep in mind is this in LSI 1, LSI 2, or both? I would certainly expect it to be an LSI2, because where people are really trying new things and experimenting and trying to approach their people differently and so on, is usually in behavior. You see this also in culture. As people join new organizations, the first profile to change is their LSI2, as they begin trying to do things differently to fit into the culture of this place. And it takes much more time for those patterns in culture to get into psychological patterns in LSI1. So you would certainly expect to see the greatest shift in LSI2, but that may not be the case. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. If you're seeing this in LSI1, I would be much more concerned about it, because that really reflects sort of when we look at profiles that are becoming more defensive, I think as coaches, we should approach this from a perspective of concern rather than, and I think this is where the coach is having some difficulties. They feel like they're bringing across sort of bad news. You've moved backwards, or this is not the progress we wanted, and how do I convey this bad news? I wouldn't try to see it that way. I would see this hopefully as a learning opportunity still, but from the perspective of sort of being concerned about why we're viewing things, especially if this is an LSI1, in more defensive ways than we have previously. That doesn't bode well for things like the focal participants' level of stress, psychological well-being, satisfaction, and so on. So if you're seeing that trend, it's sort of concerning. Okay. So if that makes some sense, then questions, by the way, before we get into the next point, which is kind of the different patterns that we might see. So I tried to organize these in terms of frequency, the most common versus what I think are the rarest. To be honest with you, I've seen several of these category A type situations, but very few of the others. So let's start at the top. So in many cases, what you'll see if you remeasure, and this is especially true if we remeasure too quickly, is an increase in defensive behavior, especially around passive styles and notoriously within dependence. In fact, I remember in the research team, we used to look at people who were just joining organizations and just changing their positions significantly within organizations. And it's fairly common to see an increase in defensive behavior, especially in dependence in those situations. The reason, a lot of this tends to be really a natural reaction to change. So if I'm promoted to a new position or in a new organization, then there is going to be some learning and questioning that probably is going to take place around what is expected of me, how am I expected to do this job, what is a good job, when is it expected, the culture and expectations of the individual we're trying to explore. That in a lot of ways is dependent behavior. I'm asking people, how do I do my job, and in what way should it be performed, and how do we judge its effectiveness, and these sorts of things. That should go away as people learn the new role and begin taking that role themselves. And then you'll see that shift toward more constructive styles. But it's not uncommon, especially again, if people are new to their position or role, and also keep in mind new in the development process, because coaching people is also a change, or it should be. So a lot of, okay, I'm maybe been a very red leader in the past, and now I need to try to do more of these constructive interpersonal things. There may be a time period in which I'm kind of unsure about how do I do that here. And I might reach out to my coach and ask things like, well, how do I ask for people's input? And when is that appropriate? And how do I, that's a form of dependent behavior. I shouldn't be for the next 10 years asking my coach how to communicate with my people, but it is a response that's very common to change. So, and again, this characteristic of one defensive style increasing significantly is by far the most common. Dependence is the most common in my experience. Hans and others, I'd be interested to hear from you if you have other experiences. But one style, I've seen it fairly frequently. You'll also see things like approval. I've seen in individual profiles where, we're going through this leadership development initiative and we need to be more inspiring, motivating leaders, and we don't really know how to do that. And so we're, rather than being more affiliative, we're falling into approval types of patterns. That sort of thing is not particularly uncommon. I've even seen, I think in one case where and this gets back to inappropriate use of the tools, but where the organization was basically comparing individuals against one another in terms of who was becoming and developing most constructive styles. It was a competition to become constructive. And one of the styles you saw develop most quickly was not actually constructive, but rather competitive. So those are interesting. I'll talk about the questions to maybe ask when you see those individual defensive styles increasing. But I usually find them very interesting because it typically has to do with how we've approached this development and change. The next category, and this is very rare, but is basically a general shift from one defensive cluster to the other. I think the only one that maybe two that I've seen is really moving from generally aggressive red behavior to passive patterns. These are very rare. We're talking about big shifts here because, with this one, we're talking about one style that we're changing, which is realistic. And when we coach people, we suggest they only select one or two styles to work on developing, because shifting more than that is really quite difficult to do. And not only shifting multiple styles, but from sort of an aggressive approach to a passive approach is also a very big change. So that is rarer and sort of more significant in terms of why that might be playing out. Again, in my experience, and we'll come back to this in terms of questions, it tends to be things like, we've got an aggressive culture, an aggressive leadership team, or I'm a fairly red leader. I hate to use the aggressive patterns as an example, but they kind of ask for it, right? And now I'm not supposed to do that anymore. Don't be power oriented. Don't point out flaws. And we've applied sort of a restrictive approach to how leaders developed, and we focus on telling them what aggressive behaviors not to do. And that doesn't help anything for them to understand what to do. They still, however, perceive the risk of how I should not behave, and therefore they might likely start falling into passive styles. You'll also see this in teams as well. For example, if we're a notorious pattern in teams that are highly competitive is that we'll be very highly competitive for as long as we can sort of sustain that. Then we either leave the team or organization, or we fall into an opposite kind of pattern, like of avoidance. I compete, and if I can't win at competing, then I just don't play the game at all. And you'll see that kind of shift from general aggressive approaches to general passive approaches. I imagine the same sort of thing could happen the other way around. Passive leaders sort of becoming more aggressive, especially if they're encouraged to be more clear and proactive and encourage their people and get them to move towards goals and those sorts of things. That could be a shift. You'll see the questions that I ask, you can understand if that's really happening, then there have to be big things that are changing. And there also has to be, I think, a misunderstanding in terms of what is constructive. And so, we've been read for so long, we don't really know how to be constructively interpersonal, so we just close our office door and don't interact and fall into those opposite patterns. Okay, the last group would be the same general profile that we saw in the initial measurement, meaning when we used LSI the first time, we got a profile, and when we remeasured a year later or 9 months later, we get a similar profile, but the entire profile is more defensive. In that case, then I think that's a more significant and concerning kind of pattern, and we'll talk about it. All right. So the next piece that we're getting into is kind of the questions I think we might want to be asking if we have these sorts of profiles. The point I'd like to make before we get into this is that the coach cannot create the change. So the individual obviously has to change themselves. The role of the coach is to help them understand, create context, and create things like this awareness, acceptance, and help them to move toward action steps. But they are the ones who create the change. So having said that, you as the coach are also not responsible, at least entirely, for steps backwards. It is the focal participant who's responsible for creating change, I think, and it's the focal participant who's responsible for creating the kind of change that they and their organization is trying to create, which I'm suspecting is blue patterns rather than more defensive styles. So with that understanding, and again, we're trying to create awareness around what's going on and what are the consequences of this. So starting with the first group, those in which a single style like dependence is more predominant when we remeasure, then I would be thinking about and really asking, sorry, this point A is before I would even give the person their report, the remeasure report, I would be very interested in how the development journey has been progressing. Something has been changing because we're seeing a change in the profile, but how is that actually happening? How is development being assessed? Is it being judged? What steps have you been taking? Really getting some feedback from the individual before they see that progress check profile on how things are going, what they've learned, whether this is working, these sorts of things. I think that's important because what you'll find is probably both a mixed feedback, meaning, yeah, we've been doing some things that are helping, but there's also some things that seem to be still confusing and even more difficult. And those will typically be the defensive patterns that have cropped up along the way. And that way, when we get into the profile, the individual has more context to understand where that is in the profile, if that makes sense. The next thing I would be very interested in is really the reaction to the profile and actually asking the person about their reaction to the profile. The thing we should be keeping in mind here is when we talk about development, we really want to talk about the opportunities and the successes. So anytime we do a progress check, really what we primarily want to be talking about, I think, is what has gone well in this profile. What blue styles do we see that are stronger? What defensive styles do we see that are weaker? And hopefully we can focus on those positive steps forward before we start focusing on the one, in this case, defensive style that is stronger. You don't want to draw attention to this as though it's wrong, but we want to understand why that might be increasing as a side effect of other development that's going on. The reaction to the profile is usually, if this is happening, quite clear. The individual is going to notice that defensive style is stronger. And in my experience and in talking to the consultants who have experienced these cases, the focal participant typically is very clearly able to explain why that pattern is taking place more frequently. And here's where you get into some of the real simple questions that I like to ask also around item level feedback. Because when you do project checks, you get project progress checks, you get item level feedback, and you can compare that from time 1 to time 2. So you can really get down to a high level of detail, not just that we're more dependent, but what specific behaviors have we been utilizing more frequently? And then we can start asking those questions of when are we doing those things and why are we doing those things? And what are you aware of? Meaning, and here's why more defensive profiles are so rare, I think, because, hopefully we've introduced the circumplex, we've introduced the tool, people understand, hopefully, that constructive styles are generally where we're going for, and defensive styles are what we should be moving away from. Now, the fact that after that kind of introduction, they don't just not take steps forward, but sort of become more defensive, it really gives you as a coach an opportunity to ask key questions around when is this happening and are you aware of it? Because with the circumplex framework and with a language to talk about these kinds of patterns, usually what we find is that people are able to say, yes, I can recognize that we've been doing more of that. And here's why and in what situations, and here are the consequences that I've seen associated with this. I think this is very important because one of the things in category A, you're probably seeing increases in constructive styles as well as an increase in a defensive style. And one of the things I think is really important is to help the focal participant understand the good things that they're seeing, the better communication, collaboration that they have with their team. What styles is that a result of and associated with versus, you know, the higher defensive style, what consequences that associated with, so that we can recognize that the constructive styles are helping us in practice. This increased defensive style is not. And we can connect some really clear examples, not only in when and why do I do this, but what are the real effects and consequences of it. So I actually kind of like having these because it gives you an opportunity to give the focal participant a very clear example of a defensive behavior that they should now be able to understand when it happens, where it happens, what the causation behind all of this is. And therefore really ask, I think as a coach, some questions around the awareness, acceptance, and action model that we use. Because if you think about it, if you introduced constructive styles in the circumplex a year ago and they tried to make some steps toward constructive patterns and actually are more defensive in their remeasure, then, you know, there's a disconnect somewhere in here. Either there's an awareness issue in terms of they don't really understand what constructive behavior is versus defensive styles, or they don't recognize when they're doing these things, right? So an awareness challenge, or they're aware of it, but they don't recognize the consequences that it's having, and then that gives you an opportunity to talk about that. Yes, I see that I've been dependent. Do I recognize the consequences that that has, and that that's not really the way I want to move forward? If I say yes to that as well, so yes, I'm aware of the defensive behavior, I know it has consequences, but then I went ahead and did it anyway, then there's another kind of question you might want to ask the focal participant around why that seemed appropriate, despite the fact that we knew it was happening and knew the consequences of it and still chose to react and respond in that way. So there's a breakdown somewhere in that understanding. All right. Trying to keep on schedule. The next category is sort of the general shift, which I think I've only seen maybe 2 or 3 times. So we're talking about pretty rarely here, moving from I'm primarily aggressive to primarily passive defensive. I would have some questions, again, kind of before we get into the report. If I were the coach, I might be asking myself how I or the organization or whomever, how did we introduce the circumplex? One of the potential explanations for this is that we really misunderstood what it is to be constructive. And, you know, again, as I think I already mentioned, sort of those aggressive patterns, I'm misunderstanding passive behavior for constructive behavior. So rather than becoming more constructive, I become more passive. By the way, there's a whole, I think there's a cultural side topic about this. And what I mean is, over the years, I've noticed that the more defensive an organization's culture is, the harder it is for them to sort of grasp constructive patterns and how constructive patterns help in terms of playing out and helping people and organizations to perform effectively. And that kind of awareness level seems to be associated with their current culture. The more defensive the culture becomes, the more basically transactional it becomes. You've got some red behavior somewhere and you've got green behavior somewhere, and they're moving back and forth sort of against, it's very transactional. So the problem with this is we start to see the organization as a zero-sum game. For me to win, you must lose. And therefore, those seem like the only viable choices. Either I work against others or I allow them to it's very transactional. The point is that in that case, and I've had this, where in a very aggressive organizations or teams, they're convinced that constructive styles are really passive. And that misunderstanding, I think, could be a reason that leaders who were aggressive might have the tendency to fall into passive patterns, either because they think that's what constructive is, or they don't know how to interact with their people constructively, so they don't. And both of those things could lead to a general shift from, in this case, aggressive to passive norms. So how do we introduce the circumplex? Do they really understand the styles? Can they bridge that from the model to my everyday work and understand what that means for me and what I should be doing? What action steps have you taken? I would be very interested in this because, again, to have that kind of a dramatic shift across, the clusters is pretty rare. So what have they been doing? They must have been doing some pretty dramatically different things to have that kind of a shift across, again, the circumplex in 9 to 12 months. And that will be very interesting because what you're hearing, I think, in this is something around this last point. What I mean is the steps that they've taken in the development. Well, the defensive behavior, I hope we understand, is security oriented. So we're doing that out of a sense of insecurity. In the case where we move from aggressive patterns to passive patterns or vice versa, we're really not constructively addressing whatever that risk was. We're just changing the way that we defensively respond to it. So rather than working against my team, I don't interact with them whatsoever. And that's not only a pretty dramatic shift, but something that the individual should be able to have recognized and also recognize the effects of this. The last point really is, well, again, in a way, good. We want to bring across good news, and in a way, it is good that we've created some change. This person has done something, but we need to get at why we still felt that the best way to react and respond was in a security-oriented way rather than more constructively. All right, that will bring me to the last group here. In this case, we're talking about basically a very similar profile to the initial measurement. We remeasure 12 months later, and we have a profile that's significantly more defensive. In this case, in this case, I would be just generally concerned about the individual. I mean, this point, I'm not sure if it goes from coach to counselor, but especially if this is showing up in LSI1, and I talked about this briefly before, you're really seeing a case in which this person is, becoming more security oriented and less satisfaction oriented. And that is not positive for, again, a lot of their personal psychological aspects of well-being. So I would be asking really questions around what's going on. Not only is this person apparently not been successful in kind of creating constructive change, but they seem to feel even more at risk and more insecure than they were previously. And that's something we need to understand before I think you can really coach the individual forward, because if things are getting riskier, the further we move ahead, it makes it very, very difficult for them to actually respond constructively. So in this case, I would be concerned about what's going on around this individual, what's going on in your team, in your role, in your life. This is a really significant and fundamental and concerning kind of change. What steps have you taken? Again, if we're talking about a profile that's become more defensive, I'm going to guess that they're not really approaching things differently other than just more defensively, using the security-oriented patterns that they've already had in their profile and just using them to greater effect and extent, and less relying upon constructive styles. And again, that's referring to some form of a increased perceived insecurity in the individual and a predictable lower levels of satisfaction and well-being. So again, I know I put this point in previously, what is their reaction to the profile? But in this case, I would be expecting something different. In the previous case, maybe they thought, this is a good thing, especially if it's I'm moving from green to red. At least I'm pushing things forward, whereas before I wasn't. Maybe they have a positive reaction to that, right? And in the first case as well, I am more power oriented than I was before. That's good. That means I'm in control of my team. Those kind of misunderstandings that can play out in people believing that those defensive styles are good and therefore reacting positively when they see them in their profile. I don't think you'll have that in this case, because it's not a given style, it's an overall increase in security orientation. So I very much doubt that they'll view this as a positive change. I would be more concerned that they would see this as somehow their life is out of control. They don't have the ability to create change. They've tried but failed. And this is confirmation that they don't have the ability to change and things are continuing to get worse. And I've whittled this down to not only the rarest, but also the most concerning kind of combination that I might see. I'm not really sure that I have seen this. It would be very rare, but it would be something that, again, part of the coaching in the very beginning is helping people to understand that the way you think about the world, and especially yourself, and the way you choose to react and respond, or your own responsibility, they're the only things that you can control. So with that understanding, and with the framework of the circumplex to understand, what is satisfaction and security, for people to then in 6 or 9 months to systemically become more security oriented, means they're probably also aware of that as they're doing it because they're in the coaching. So I would be very concerned in this case, but also very curious in terms of why we've seen a shift in this direction. What is going on with you, and why apparently do you feel unable to react in any way differently than you have previously, other than with greater security orientation? All right. So I don't know if I've answered anyone's question about coaching defensive profiles. Again, they are quite rare. I would say somewhere between 80 to 90% of them are category A, where, it's a given style. It may be something that's culturally accepted. That's a strong defensive pattern in the culture, so I can kind of get away with it as I move forward in this change. Again, I have to emphasize the change and development journey for the individual is change for them, and this is why it's so important at the very beginning, when people are introduced to LSI or LWS and coaching, that they see it as a positive learning opportunity and not something that is criticism or risk or that sort of thing. The more that we can frame it in that way, that you are in control of these things do matter, and if you want to create something different, then here's a framework to apply to do that. When people take steps backwards in profiles, it's again, it's usually that first group where we've either misunderstood a style. Perfectionism sounds good, so let's encourage our engineers to be perfectionistic, or it's something that we fall into because it's makes sense, like dependent behavior when we're new to the role, or it's how we typically behave in the teams. So I hope this helps. At the end of the day, it certainly matters. So I guess the profiles behind me are just to illustrate again that, the more we can move in those constructive directions, the better we tend to see, again, the well-being and performance of people. So every journey has a few steps backwards. That's sort of part of learning. So again, when we coach, it should always be from the framework of what can we learn from this in order to move forward. And oftentimes, to be honest with you, clients learn more from the few steps they take backwards than they have from all the good steps forward that they make. So when these things happen, hopefully we can learn from them and continue to see them as opportunities for learning as we continue our journey forward. I think that's all I had for you today. I know we're a little early, but that's in part the goal, just in case there are any questions from anyone, or if anyone has any input, Hans, or anyone has seen such cases and would like to share their insights. No, fair enough. All right.